I think it was really, really important for me with Fear of Rain that we get the accuracy and not sugarcoat things, because that is the reality of living either with a mental illness or with someone you love who has a mental illness.
Brian Smith here, and welcome to the Dream Path Podcast, where I try to get inside the heads of talented creatives from all over the world. My goal is to demystify and humanize the creative process and make it accessible to everyone. Now let's jump in. Castille Landon's on the show. Castille is an actor, screenwriter, and director who wrote and directed the psychological thriller Fear of Rain, which is now available wherever you rent and buy movies. Starring Madison Iseman, Harry Connick Jr., Katherine Heigl, and Israel Broussard. Fear of Rain is about a girl named Rain living with schizophrenia. Struggling with terrifying hallucinations, Rain begins to suspect her neighbor has kidnapped a child. But because of her mental illness, those around her don't believe her, and even she has a hard time sorting through what's real or imagined. When I researched Castille's background and filmography to prepare for the interview, I marveled at everything she has accomplished by the age of 29. She has 25 television and film acting credits, including a role on the film Sex Ed, starring Haley Joel Osment. She has an undergraduate degree from Harvard and a master's from Oxford. And she has written and directed 3 feature films, and just finished directing 2 other feature films in the After film series, based upon the novel written by Anna Todd. In this interview, you'll hear how Castille developed the story idea for Fear of Rain, what her thought process was when casting the film, how she dealt with last-minute casting changes during pre-production, why the themes and metaphors in Fear of Rain resonate with a wide audience, and what advice she has for aspiring filmmakers wanting to break into the business. You'll also hear Castille's thoughts on the challenges facing actors versus writers and directors, and how her experience as an actor has helped her become a more empathetic and effective director. So without further ado, let's jump into my chat with actor, writer, and director Castille Landon. Castille, welcome to Dream Path Podcast.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
And happy Valentine's Day to you and Kate.
Thank you. Are you doing anything special?
Probably just more snow shoveling, actually.
That's romantic.
Yeah, we're kind of buried over here in Washington State. Where are you located?
I'm actually in Florida right now, so kind of the opposite. It's like humid and muggy and gross.
Oh, yeah, I've been in that Florida heat and humidity, and I used to live in Houston, so I understand the oppressiveness of the humidity.
Yeah, oppressive is how I describe it too. And I like, when you're in school, they tell you about the atmosphere of Venus and how it's like so strong, it would just crush you. I feel like that's what it's like going outside right now. Not right now, like in a couple months, it will be like that.
I hear you. When I was in Houston, I played football, and they take their football very seriously there. So I took it as a class in school, and I would take it as a first period class. They would wash my clothes. I would come back after school, another practice after school, and football in the heat. And Florida and Texas are both huge football states. I don't know how they do it.
No.
Yeah.
And your poor parents having to do that much laundry.
No, they did my laundry for me. That's how seriously Texas takes their football.
Oh, wow.
The high schools actually do the laundry for their
nice.
football players. Yeah.
That's really nice.
So you grew up in Florida?
I did, yeah, until I was like 15. And then I moved to LA to act. And I did the whole homeschooling thing. And then eventually went to college, went back to LA. And then just like with the pandemic, I sold my place in LA and moved for the first time in, I guess, since I was 15. So like almost 15 years. I just decided that was it. I needed to. And I didn't move back to Florida. I moved, I bought a place in Kentucky so that I could be near my horses.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that explains the horse-themed screenplays, I guess.
Yeah, the first two. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
kind of like an easy. Nobody wants to make horse movies, or like they don't really make them well, and they're usually very expensive. But we have horses, so it was very easy for us to get those going. So it was like the best way to learn to do film. I think is to make a film as opposed to just going to film school.
Yeah, so going back to these screenplays of Albion and Apple of My Eye, the horse-themed movies, you
Mhm.
were saying that not many screenwriters like to tackle these screenplays and these subject matters, but you had access to horses, and it sounds like you were
Yeah, so
following the old rule, write what you know.
yeah, I mean, I from a writing standpoint, I don't know how many writers write about horses, but I meant, I guess, more from like a production and directing standpoint. It was easy, so I kind of like my intention wasn't necessarily to set out to write initially. Um, Really, I came at everything filmmaking as a way of uh, creating my own content in order to be able to act, and then I found out as I started doing that, I found myself being like, "Ugh, do I have to go in front of the camera? Like, can I just watch the actors doing what they do?" And so it kind of like all naturally happened.
Hmm. So the writing process itself, I would imagine that there's a technical aspect of it that you can't learn in a creative writing program, even at Oxford and Harvard, like the actual formatting of the screenplay. But and that's something you could probably get from books. But what did you get from your formal education, which is very impressive, by the way? Harvard undergrad and Oxford masters for creative writing. What did you get from those programs that has informed your approach to creative writing today?
Um, well, I think so. I studied English in undergrad with an emphasis in Shakespearean literature. And what I loved about that program was the diversity of just a liberal arts program and being able to learn from basically the best teachers in the world. I think that that's really the only thing that separates, or maybe not the only thing, but that's like the defining characteristic of what separates an Ivy League school from a normal, any other college, right? Is that teachers that are there are like, that is what they aspired to do. They aspired to teach. So it's kind of just a different experience learning from people like that. Um, so I'm really lucky in that sense. And because of the caliber of the teachers, I was really able to sink my teeth into basically whatever I was learning. And I think what's great about that is it really um, opens your eyes to a lot of different. Everything is a story when you're taught by a great teacher. Everything becomes, no matter whether it's science or even math, it all becomes kind of a story as opposed to just like this thing we learn because we have to learn.
Mm.
Um, so I think I'm like such an academic by heart. Honestly, if I could be in school forever, I would. Um, so, and that's because I like to study everything, because I like to tell stories about those things. Um, and the creative writing, which I did study at Oxford for my master's, um, I I think it really helped because I did this um, cross genre kind of thing. Like it's not a screenwriting program or a poetry program. You're doing all of it and experimenting. And what that does as a writer, I hadn't realized, I guess, because I was just writing screenplays at that time. Really, um, I learned how important different things are to incorporate. Like it really strengthened my screenwriting, actually doing poetry, for instance, because poetry is all about the economy of language, right? Like you can't use too many words. Whereas, when you're writing prose, what have you, you can
Right.
really go on and on and on. but a screenplay is just like poetry in a lot of ways. You have to be concise with what you say. So I think learning to kind of write across the media or genres or whatever, that was really helpful for me.
And then the actual technical aspect of screenwriting, did you take any courses in that, or did you just order a few books, the Sid Field on screenwriting and all of the classics?
Yeah, I ordered the classics. I think, Save the Cat is probably my favorite of them. Um, and I think just getting like a formatting program as far as like the actual technical elements. Do you mean like the formatting, or you mean like doing a beat sheet and getting all of that stuff?
All of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the format side of it is just easiest to get a formatting program and it does it for you. Um, and as far as the technical, like setting things up, I am still learning that because I never want to do it and I get into a crunch when I don't every single time, you know?
So when you were 15 and you were acting,
hmm
were you dabbling in writing at that point?
Yeah, I would write a monologue for myself. I would write my own scenes. Anytime there was like an acting class that I would take, um, where we were supposed to find scenes that we really loved to perform, I would write them myself. Because I mean, sometimes I wouldn't, but that's really I think where it started was writing that material to be able to play a character I wanted to play because I just
Mhm.
didn't see myself um, up on screen a lot of the time. Like I didn't feel like I was represented um, very accurately, and or like that there weren't interesting enough characters because I was a teenage girl and really like so many of the portrayals of teenage girls are kind of daft or they're just like a foil. So I wasn't really interested in any of that.
So you're in the acting world for a while, and then you head off into academia. And when you were in college, undergrad, and doing your master's at Oxford, were you acting at that point? Were you continuing to write creatively outside of school? What was your trajectory there creatively?
So at some point during my undergrad, and I think it was pretty early on, I do remember I made my first movie as a director. I went and made Albion in Bulgaria. And I remember that because I would have to get up at like 2 in the morning to be able to Zoom, like this whole pandemic thing where everybody's complaining about like, oh man, we have to do college from home. I actually did that a lot.
Yeah.
Because I was working and working in Bulgaria full day, your 12-hour, 14-hour day, and then logging on and doing classes at that time. I can't remember what year that was though. So I was working simultaneously with all the way through both of my degrees.
And the themes of disability in Apple of My Eye and in Fear of Rain, was that intentional on your part to take a character and saddle them with these very specific rules of their world through that disability? And the reason I ask that is that I'm finding as I talk to more screenwriters that the more specific the world is, the easier it is to tell that story in a compelling way. Whether it's a specific setting they're in, a specific religion, or science fiction set of rules. But here you've chosen schizophrenia for Fear of Rain and blindness for Apple of My Eye to kind of create these specific rules. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that device in storytelling.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I've never actually thought of it that way before. I mean, as far as like having rules set out, I think I really gravitate towards adapting novels or adapting existing material. So I would say that's definitely something I love, and probably a lot of writers love. Um, I don't know in those instances whether it's whether I was consciously thinking of that though or not. I think it's more a case of like I had an interest in imagining what it would be like to go through life with something like schizophrenia or with being visually impaired, and so I wanted to explore that for myself, and also kind of give other people the opportunity to explore it through film. I think there's a lot of little communities of people or like niches that aren't represented in film. And that's what I'm really interested in seeing and doing. So I think that's where it came from with those. But I do think you have a really good point.
Yeah, it's interesting because I read a lot about storytelling and screenwriting, and one of the rules that kind of bubbles up to the surface as a common denominator is, conflict. More conflict. That character needs more conflict, and when you have a character with a disability like schizophrenia, which is largely not known to the audience, they don't have experience with it for the most part. Same thing with blindness. I would imagine that that specificity really gives you a lot to work with as a storyteller,
Mm,
and to let that unfold in a compelling way. And I used to work at a psychiatric hospital for teenagers, children and teenagers, before I became an attorney, before I became a podcaster. So it was interesting in Fear of Rain to see how you captured that disability and how you portrayed it. And one of the things I noticed that you did really well was the disconnect between the protagonist, Rain, and her dad in terms of him trying to talk sense into her.
mhm,
And he would say, "Do you hear yourself? Do you hear what you're saying?" And that look in her eye, like, "What are you talking about?" Like they are not speaking the same language.
mhm,
And it's the same when I had schizophrenic patients at the hospital. If you try to tell a joke to a schizophrenic maybe their medication isn't right, or maybe they're just in a really low point in their illness, um, they don't get it, and
mhm.
they're just not on the same plane. And so I appreciated the way that the research that you obviously did into that ailment and that disorder, um, and put it on film. So well done.
Thank you. Yeah, I did do a lot of research, and I think, as you're saying that, I just realized this is actually one of my last scheduled interviews, and I am sad that I just am realizing that I uh, have dated two people who have very much spoken different languages because of mental illness, or just neurodiversity. Um, and it is very much, it's weird that it just took like framing it in that way for me to even realize that is the case, right? Like you're
Mhm.
speaking two different languages. Um, and yeah, that is exactly what John and Rain have going on. And both of them, I think, are speaking a kind of general language of love. But yeah, the specificity of that, how they express themselves and where they are at any given moment, is very different. And I think it was really, really important um, for me with Fear of Rain, that like we get the accuracy and not sugarcoat things, because that is the reality of living either with a mental illness or with someone you love who has a mental illness. Like you can love someone, and that doesn't mean that there aren't traumatic events that occur, or that you don't say something you regret. And there was a lot of temptation or guidance from people that I think didn't quite understand the project when we were in development, that they would give notes like, "Oh, he kind of seems a little like an asshole here," and it's like, when you're going through something like that and it's your child, you you kind of lose your own self.
Mhm.
He's losing his like his grasp on reality as well. It does things to you that you wouldn't normally do in other circumstances. And the more you love someone, I think the more kind of irrational you can sometimes be.
Right. I was going to mention that. I'm glad you brought that up, that there is a scene, and I'm not going to describe it in detail because I don't want to give it away, but there's a scene where I think the audience will likely lose their affection for the dad
Mm,
because of a conflict that happens with Rain.
mhm,
And you're right. There's a humanity to that in
mm,
revealing that duality of man, that classic duality of man. We're all capable of good and evil, and this isn't necessarily a good evil situation, but it's just humanity bubbling to the surface with um, anger and fear, and these emotional situations sometimes result in that type of conflict. And I'm not saying it's excusable or forgivable, but that's what happens. And I think it's really important to put that on film without sugarcoating it.
mhm. Yeah, I think so too.
As you may have noticed, there are great resources and advice mentioned in all our episodes. And for many of them, we actually collect all of these resources for you in one easy place, our newsletter. You can go to dreampathpod.com/newsletter to join. It's not fancy, just an email about each week's episode, featured artists, and resources to help you on your journey. Thanks. And now back to the interview. So your casting choices here. Can you tell us about the casting process and what you were thinking with Harry Connick and Katherine Heigl, and also with the most interesting casting choice was Israel for me, and I thought that might have been maybe the most challenging one too,
Oh, why is
but
that?
because he was, and again, I'm trying not to give anything away on this interview because I want my listeners to go see it without any expectations of the plot. But his character had to a certain,
Mm,
um, straddle two worlds, perhaps.
mhm.
And there was some ambiguity about him in the film that was not present in other characters, at least not initially. And I'm wondering, because he was kind of this perfect boyfriend character. How did you seek him out, or what was that casting process like? And what were your thoughts going into the casting process in general?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for me with the casting on this was a Rain, was finding the right Rain, because the movie really rests on her shoulders. If Madison Iseman had not been able to deliver the kind of performance she did, the film would not have worked.
Right.
And of course, I didn't tell her that going into it because that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
But it was, we searched for a long time for that person. And it was really important to us to get name actors for the parents, um, because we wanted to have the freedom to cast whoever was best for the role, with Rain in particular. Um, so we saw a lot of girls. I had like a top three, and I think Maddie was actually one of the last people that came into audition. And as soon as she did, I was like, "That's it!" Like, just you knew instantly, because she is. I've never seen anyone like her. I mean, I work with young actors a lot, and she's just so great. But the most nerve wracking, actually, in terms of casting, was Harry, because I talked to Katherine. I'm very familiar with her work, and that role, I think she really fits, and kind of it made sense. But Harry, he doesn't do a lot of movies. And the last movies that I had seen him in were Dolphin Tale movies. So while I had seen him do really amazing, I mean, not that he's not amazing in that, it's just so different from this. But I'd seen him do more intense roles, but it was earlier in his career. I had no idea what was going to show up on set. And with those big name actors, you don't get to audition them; you just make
Hmm.
offers. Um, But what I loved about him was that he is so lovable because, like you said, there are moments in this movie where we don't always love him. He does do some, awful things that would be, I think, unforgivable in the eyes of the audience if you had the wrong actor in that role.
Right.
So, like, to be able to go head to head with this young girl who's going through this, but also be someone that the audience gives the benefit of the doubt to and can see how much he loves her. That was a challenge. And it wasn't until the first scene that I was kind of sweating it up to that point, because he could have been, for all I know, he could have been some kind of cheeseball, actor at this point in his career. But thank God he's not. He's so good. And he just
That's
got
so
better
funny.
and better.
Yeah. He has so much charisma, I think, because of his musical career, that
Mhm.
and it's a testament to how beloved he is in the musical world, that he's still relevant and he's still putting out great music. But
Mhm.
when you are performing the way he does, and I've seen him perform live, I was actually on his float in Mardi Gras a couple of years ago.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I thought when I was going to be on his float, I would get to meet him, but this float is like 10 miles long. So
Oh.
there was no no chance of meeting Harry Connick. But he is so charismatic
Mhm.
that he just lights up the screen. So you're right. There's this instant affection for this character, and that gives him the freedom to kind of make some mistakes.
Mhm.
So what a fortunate turn of events for you without an
Yeah.
audition.
Yeah. And he's just such a kind human being. So to be able to, like, because there is a component of this where when you're asking actors to go to such a dark place, especially young actors, they can sometimes lose themselves in that, and I even lose myself in it sometimes with this one. So to have someone who is not only wildly talented in front of the camera, but also um, kind of elevates the emotion, or like just elevates the mood on set every single time he's there, is so helpful, and he put Madison at ease, and he kind of became a father figure to her, like an extra parent figure to her throughout the
Hmm.
course of making that film. And I think it shows, honestly.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up how important Madison's character was in terms of the casting choice, because when I was talking about Israel, I was talking more about the fact that with Madison, I mean, that Rain's character is real, and there's a certain certainty to that character and her role in the film. But with Israel, like I said, he's straddling these two worlds, and he's also this very welcome presence amid this world of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I thought he just did a great job in that role.
I think
And
so. But what's interesting with him is I cast a different actor who's a friend of mine and very well known, and he um, bailed at like the last minute, and um, so we had not even looked hardly for other people. And like I think it was like a couple weeks out. I can't remember exactly, but it was pretty close to shooting, and we'd already casted Maddie, and we had a chemistry read between the two of them, and they were great together. So it was a real blow to me, especially since it was a friend. And it was weird because I went back to my notebooks, because this film I wrote like 3 years before we actually got to make it. And as soon as I uh, start writing something, I come up with a kind of ideal cast in my head. Um, and I went back to my notebooks to see who I had written down, and Israel was on there, like
hmm,
on my list. Um, and so we put the offer out to Izzy, and he loved the role, and took it. And he's someone who brings 100% of himself. He's not even like, it's so great because he can't lie, Israel can't. And I think
hmm
that's what makes him such a perfect Caleb, because I think Caleb's kind of like that too. He's just so authentically him.
Right.
And luckily, authentically Israel is like a wonderful human being.
Uh-huh. Right.
So yeah, I think he just has this kind of like almost childlike magic to him, or kind of an innocence and an acceptance in that. You know, he's not judgmental, and he's very similar to the character, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Or else, I don't know, maybe he just became more like the character around me because of what it was.
Because
But
he's such a great actor.
yeah.
So going back to Madison's role and her performance, did you worry going in that you were going to find an actress that perhaps, or you were going to be stuck with an actress that was not capable of that balance between capturing the horror of that reality, but also not overplaying it, kind of an overwrought performance? Because I would think that would be instinctively where young actors go if they're trying to play someone who's crazy, quote unquote, or insane or going out of their mind. They're just going to go over the top, and on screen, it's going to seem off. So how
Yeah.
did you approach that issue?
I mean, I think that was something that we really looked for in the casting phase, when we were auditioning actors, because there is the temptation to overdo it, and you see it in a lot of movies, and it makes it very uncomfortable to watch. I think there's a movie out right now that is facing that kind of issue. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So it all came down to auditioning. I mean, I think it would have been something that I would have been terrified of had we had to cast some name actress in that role. And there was a producer on prior to this that was like, we want Bella Thorne. And it's like, you know, I don't know, maybe she would have done it perfectly, but like to just put an offer out the way that we did with the other cast members,
Yeah.
without having the opportunity to see someone come in and do it, I think that might be where you get yourself into trouble as a filmmaker. I think with complex characters like this, you just have to see them do it, because even the most professional or talented actors, I don't know that they could necessarily play someone this nuanced in such a way that didn't make you cringe to watch it.
Yeah,
You
that's a
know?
good way of putting it, cringe. That's what it causes in the audience. You're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, ouch."
Oh God.
And
Yeah.
Eugenie's character, it's,
Mhm.
she was her character's name Danny? Is that the
Mhm.
name? Yeah,
Yeah.
so right out of the gate, the very first scene where she kind of appears through the window of
Mhm.
the car, she's like, you're like, "Okay, now, we're in for something pretty fun here."
Yeah.
Because she's so eccentric and,
Mhm.
and lights up the screen in her own way. So what were your
Mhm.
thoughts going into that casting choice?
So that role was actually written as a man, Dan McConnell, and the producers couldn't agree on who we wanted. There were two people that we saw so many audition tapes for that role, and it came down to two men, and there were, I mean, just brawls constantly over who it was going to be. Um, and we were down to looking at locations, and I saw a picture of this house with the homeowner in it, and my friend who was the location manager was like, oh yeah, she owns the house. And there was just something that immediately clicked for me. And he said she was an actress, and she'd done the Hunger Games, and I was like, I've never heard of her, I need to see her on tape for this. And she sent in her tape within like 24 hours, because she just nails everything she does, I think. Um, and it was perfect. But it was also a huge change to the story, because there's so many other elements that the character then takes on as a woman versus a man. Things you lose, things you gain.
Mhm.
Um, and I didn't think that, given the turmoil over this character, that my producers were just going to accept it. So I actually sent her audition tape without her or anyone else knowing, to Harry. because I thought Harry's going to dig this. Harry loves like interesting women. And he wrote back and was like, "Oh, you have to do this. This is so cool." And so I just forwarded his message with her audition tape to the producers and was like, "Guys, this is a great idea." And
Mm-hmm.
because I think, I got his seal of approval, they were on board with it. And then it became Danny McConnell.
Oh, that's brilliant, actually. Bring
Yeah.
Harry in because once he blesses it, I don't know how you can go back from that.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. Exactly.
so the release of the film, it's now available streaming on all platforms, right? Or is
Yeah,
it okay?
Apple, Amazon, everywhere people can buy or rent movies.
Awesome. So, what are your current and future projects that you're excited about?
Well, I just finished filming two movies in Bulgaria over the fall and winter. So I'm in post on those. And they're the third and fourth installments of the After franchise. So romance. And it's kind of living in a similar world as Rain. I mean, there's no mental illness. Well, actually, there is. There's addiction, alcoholism, um, but I like that I like stuff that is geared towards young women, honestly, and whether
Mm-hmm.
that's to kind of open up a larger discussion about mental health or about sexuality and how to express that in a safe way, both mentally and physically, which I think these films do. That's exciting. And I have, now that I've done, those three movies, being Fear of Rain and then the two after movies, I have a lot of stuff coming up.
I would imagine. Yeah, I imagine
Yeah,
that this opened up quite a few doors for you.
yeah, it is. It's great.
Are you going to think about going back into acting, or are you going to stick behind the camera for a while?
I'm kind of open to doing whatever. I did act in a movie last year that Justin Long directed, just kind of as a little fun thing. I love acting. The thing is, though, it wasn't good for my own mental health. Auditioning, because that's what acting actually is, and I think a lot of people don't understand that. Like, you don't actually get to act very often.
Hmm.
You are auditioning, and you're selling yourself. And I am not, it takes a real toll on someone. Like, that's why those people get paid what they get paid, because it is, it puts you through the ringer.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, when I write something, I always get nervous to share it with people because it does feel like an extension of myself. But it's so much more personal, even when it's not personal. I mean, when I see an actor come in the room, I want them to do really well. I like, every single time someone comes in the room, I'm like, this could be the person. And then usually it's not. But I
Hmm.
never have ill wishes. But when you're on the other side of that table, man, you just are, it's a lot. You
Yeah.
feel like you're never good enough. So all of that is to, it's a long way of saying I would love to do other stuff, but I'm not going to put myself through the audition process. So I
Yeah.
don't know where that leaves me.
Yeah. Well, doesn't that experience, that personal experience with the emotional turmoil of auditioning, give you something to offer actors when you are auditioning them? I mean, you have that level of empathy now.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think absolutely, and I think it really helps. Like, my background in acting, I think is really helpful when working with actors, particularly with young actors. Um, so I love that I have that background. Whether I actually use it, you know, in the future or not, I think it's really helpful.
What was it like? This is kind of a random question, but what was it like working with Burt Reynolds before he passed? That must have been one of his last films.
Yeah, it was, and he. I loved working with him. He's such a sweetheart, and at the same time, like, it made me really sad, because he was this huge movie star, and then to kind of see I guess, him at the end, going towards the end of his career. And he had to use a prompter. And um, honestly, through like the month that we had him on set, I wasn't fully sure if he even knew my name. Um, Even though he was like, we constantly talked, he just was kind of a little out of it. But then I heard afterwards he would like constantly talk about me, which was really cool. Um, and he like we did a film festival thing together, and he kept mentioning working with me instead of the film that he was there to promote. So, I mean, he was so lovely, and he used to tell, oh, God, I have this obsession, I guess you could say, with old Hollywood and like the kind of machinations. And he would tell me all of these stories about how he would date uh, Lucille Ball's daughter, and even though Lucy was, about the same age as him, and he's like,
Right.
"Oh, no, I wouldn't date her daughter." I'm
Yeah.
like, "Oh my God."
Yeah. It's the kind of stuff that doesn't really date well, but in terms of the jokes or the humor of people from that generation, but
Mhm,
still you kind of have this reverence and this appreciation for the fact that he is this legend,
mhm.
and that was the humor back then. That was the the movie star approach
Yeah.
back in the day, and you just can't ignore the performances of Deliverance and Cannonball
Oh,
Run and kind of the cultural impact that that guy had.
yeah, and honestly, like, I love working with older actors. There is a difficulty working with older actors because um, it's hard to remember lines. I mean,
Right.
it's hard for me to remember lines, but once you start getting into your 60s, 70s, 80s, it is hard. Um, but there's just something so genuine. Like, I got to work with John Cleese, and I've worked with several older actors, and they they also just can't lie. I guess that's a kind of through line with what I look for in an actor is like it doesn't necessarily, I don't know, matter like all of the homework that people do and like the stress a lot of actors place into their work, all of the research and stuff. At the end of the day, it's like, can you just be genuine in front of the camera and be vulnerable enough to just be yourself without judging in, without these walls? And that's very difficult. But older actors just kind of they don't worry about it.
Yeah. You did such a nice job with Fear of Rain. I'm sure this film is going to go some great places and get awards consideration. I enjoyed it. And thanks for sharing your story with my listeners. I have one last question for you for my listeners,
Okay.
and that is this. What advice do you have for young, aspiring screenwriters, filmmakers to
Mm.
break into the business? And it can be educational advice like schooling, it can be motivational, it could be, whatever approach you want to take to talk to these young people. Pretend they're in a room, they're about to graduate from high school, and they're looking right at you.
Yeah, I would recommend studying anything but film in college, honestly. I think looking around and consuming as much material outside of your realm of expertise is the most beneficial thing you can do. Being a voracious reader and consumer of film, um, and also studying, you know, theoretical physics if that's what excites you, or really anything that you could then bring to a film is more interesting because we get in a place where if we're not exposing ourselves to different worlds, then we are only writing about writing or about filmmaking.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of filmmakers that do this, right? So I think having a breadth of experience to draw from and keeping kind of an eye on living a life of learning
Hmm.
is really important.
Yeah.
That's what I would recommend.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense because if the rule is write what the
Mm,
more you know, the more you can write about.
yeah. Yeah. And I think that there's always metaphors and for like different ways of living that people can see themselves into. Like with Fear of Rain, I think Rain having schizophrenia is relatable to any teenager who is experiencing going to high school and feeling awkward, like social awkwardness, or the experience of being a woman in this world where people don't automatically give you the benefit of the doubt. You have to kind of prove yourself. That because that's what Rain does in the film, right? Is she's having to like prove herself to get someone to believe her.
Right.
And so even as someone that doesn't have schizophrenia, you can relate to that.
Yeah.
Or I can relate to that as a woman.
Well said and great advice, Castille.
Thanks.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, I have a favor to ask. Can you go to wherever you listen to podcasts and leave me a review? Your feedback is what keeps this podcast going. You can also check us out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook with the handle @DreamPathPod. And as always, go find your dream path.